I am really excited to try and untangle a really complicated subject.
Mm,
I'm going to just go ahead and say that the more I read about this topic of how we as a nation, as a society, and how our government should consider prostitution and how to keep everybody safe while respecting everybody's rights, honestly, the longer we do this show, the more interviews that we get to do on this topic, the more I read about this topic, the less convinced that I know anything about anything. So I was
mm.
really excited to have the two of you here. I know that you've both done a bunch of research to try and present the best possible argument or understanding of this issue. But I think we can go ahead and acknowledge at the top this is weird and confusing and we don't have
Mhm.
great data and fuck if anybody knows what the hell they're talking about. Everybody
Yeah.
seems to have an agenda and hopefully we can sort it all out. But yeah, it's a thorny topic.
The one thing I think I can say with some confidence is the rest of it I really don't know exactly. There's not enough data, not enough reliable data, too much agenda going around, is that the practitioners of sex work probably don't need to face legal consequences for that work. I think
Sure.
what those folks need is support and a way out and a way into other areas of other ways of making money if they want it. Because my research showed that, and again, the data is unclear, that an overwhelming majority of the people who are engaged in sex work are not folks who are doing it with full consent, that they're doing it. A lot of people do it out of desperation. They're coerced, they're cajoled, they're forced to do so. And those are the people that I'm concerned about. I'm of course concerned about folks who do it because they want to, and those people should be protected and have the best possible life and have all rights available to them. But I think my spotlight is on those people who are being trafficked personally.
And it's certainly tricky. Arden,
Mhm.
actually, let me let you jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely share your concerns, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't want people to be trapped in an industry doing work that they're unhappy with, potentially engaging in acts that make them uncomfortable or maybe exacerbate like mental or physical health because they're not okay with what they're doing. I want those people to have a way to get out of that or to get out of the situation that got them to doing sex work in the first place. If that's like an impetus, yeah, you were definitely giving a nod towards economic situations being coercive, and I think they definitely can be. That said, I think from what I've read up on, it seems to me that decriminalization might be the best path forward to giving those people the tools to get out of that situation. But I realize there's some still disagreement on the topic, and that's what we're here to chat about tonight. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited about the notion of there possibly being some disagreement between all of us because that's usually not something that we get to do on this show. But this is such a complex issue. But let's start by saying that at least one of the reasons that I wanted to bring all this up is because a friend of the show and world famous escort Alice Little told me that the state of Oregon is currently considering decriminalization statewide. And I bring up Alice because before she mentioned it, I was completely unaware. And even after doing a lot of Googling, I still feel incredibly uninformed on what may or may not be moving forward there. Considering no state has moved to make any like meaningful change in prostitution laws in at least the last 50 years, why do y'all suppose there's so little coverage over this topic right now?
Well, if I'm being extremely charitable, I went to I went to Ballotpedia where they will often do a full breakdown of every politician that is running on a given ticket. And they'll often go over ballot propositions as well. And after enough scrolling, I was able to find that this ballot initiative is still technically pending. It doesn't look like it's gotten totally cleared yet to be on the ballot, unless that's changed since I was Googling. But as you pointed out, Christy, I was doing so much Google sleuthing the past 2 days, and this story seems to be very suppressed. And I don't want to get conspiratorial. I'm not going to like, levy any accusations that it's being intentionally suppressed or anything like that. But certainly it's hard to find information. I would have to say, again, charitable interpretation. It hasn't technically been approved yet for the ballot. Maybe
Mhm.
that is the best generous interpretation of the situation I can give as of right now.
Sure, sure. And that may explain it, but I mean in the show notes to this episode, I think I ended up linking like a student newspaper and a local newspaper. I mean, certainly the primary sources that I was after were maybe not of the rigor that I would hope for something that seemingly is so important. But then maybe it is because a similar ballot measure was pulled last year after it became clear that it was not going to pass. So maybe it just isn't realistic that passage of this bill or anything similar is coming in the next couple of years. Do y'all feel like that might be a part of this problem or a part of why at least we're not talking about it as much?
It may be. It's really hard to know for sure, but I do think there is a thing when it comes to passing laws, right? Where oftentimes it requires multiple attempts. And I mean, and we see this
Sure.
inversely from the religious right, where they'll try to fund a bill that would make it so teachers can't talk about X, Y, or Z, and doesn't pass the first time, but they rework it a little bit, and the next session they introduce it again, and that one goes through. So I think it's probably part of the process to some degree to not always have the first your first attempt work. There often, there
Sure.
can be small things about verbiage that can make a ballot not feasible. It's hard to know exactly why, but I think it's worth taking a note out of that religious right playbook of it would be unfortunate if this doesn't go through. I think from what I've read, it seems to be a good measure, but if it doesn't, we can rework it, try it again next year. Of course, I would love it to happen, at the end of this year, but we don't always get what we want. So
Sure.
working in reality.
Yeah, well, and if this were to move forward, I mean, right now, there are only 10 counties in this entire country where prostitution is legal. I mean, those 10 counties are clustered mostly in very rural Nevada. So it's kind of hard to imagine as something as huge and potentially transformative as this Oregon decrim bill ever actually happening. What kind of impact do you imagine this could have should it ever get over the finish line?
Well, I mean that's probably kind of part of what we're going to debate, right? It's hard to know exactly what the outcome is going to be. The
Sure.
ballot measure looks good to me. They've also got set aside that if this were to pass, there would be a committee established that would be reviewing how funds were spent and if any of the claims that they made about reduction of harm would actually be demonstrable at that point. Um, it, it seems to me from the evidence that I've worked with that this would be a good thing, but it is really hard to know. And until we try something different, all we can say is that what we're doing right now isn't working. When we're seeing,
I think that's fair to say.
yeah, some of the data that I saw was suggesting that of arrests relating to prostitution, like 71% in Oregon were sellers themselves. And it
Mm.
was only about 5.2% that were actually related to human trafficking. So if that data is actually to be trusted, it seemed pretty good to me. A lot of it was coming from the Oregon State Police. Um, then I would think that decriminalization would be a good thing. Prisoners famously cost tax dollars quite a lot. So there could be a lot of benefits to it, but there might be unforeseen harms as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Johnny, is there any way for us to wrap our head around how significant this bill would be if it were to pass or something similar in the near future, effectively decriminalizing for an entire state? How significant do you think that would be?
I think it would be quite significant because I think it would change the landscape of how individuals how they conduct that business. You would be able to be much more in the open. You could probably advertise in reputable those who would have them. I'm sure there's going to be some periodicals, websites that wouldn't allow them to come on, but I know they were taken off of different websites over the years. sex workers were taken off because of legal reasons, those legal reasons would be gone, and you would see them back on, I think it was Craigslist. I know there was something about Backpage a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
I think you'd see that. Being more in the open would certainly be more protective of the individuals who um, are practicing sex work. And much like the legalization of marijuana, it might make it difficult for those trying to skirt the rules to make a living because they don't need protection necessarily. They could practice it in broad daylight, so to speak. In California, you have dispensaries. So you could potentially have open brothels. And I mean, I have very mixed feelings about this, of course,
Sure.
but that's a benefit, I think. Shedding light on this, because the whole nature of this industry is that a lot of it takes place behind closed doors. That people are
That's certainly true.
afraid to turn to authorities, to those agencies that are tasked with protecting us, and eliminating that consequence of themselves getting in trouble for even acknowledging themselves or admitting that they are engaged in sex work could go a long way to rooting out the nasty parts of this industry.
Well, is there any reason to believe that whether it's this bill in Oregon or some of the maybe half dozen other that are at least tangentially or vaguely being considered in other states, is there any reason to believe that there is in the current atmosphere a appetite or a desire for change? I mean, I remember just about a year ago, we covered on this show, again, Alice Little's petition against, or lawsuit rather, against the governor of Nevada, basically just trying to get the brothels there to be under the same COVID-19 restrictions as every other comparable business. And that lawsuit was dismissed pretty handedly. Nobody was really interested in making sure that the legal sex workers there had the same protections that other people would have. I don't know if that can really be extrapolated across the entire country, but I'm not so convinced that there is a desire to see meaningful reform here. Does that feel true to y'all?
Mm.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I mean, it kind of like you mentioned at the beginning of the show, Christy, like until this ballot measure was brought to my attention for the purposes of this show, I hadn't heard of this. And I like to think of myself as a relatively plugged in person, but I think there have been certainly strong feelings amongst sex workers, of friends of mine and myself, and I think LGBT people, marginalized people generally, that these sort of reforms would be good and important. That said, I can't say that I see a really significant movement in the same vein that like LGBT rights has really grown to a massive scale. You know, it's on national news stories all over all the time. We don't
Mhm.
see that kind of attention being given to sex workers' rights. So I think that maybe there isn't a current appetite, but I think maybe this is indicative of something that is important to the people. I mean, as the ballot measure claimed, there were, I think, over 50% of Oregonians supported the measure and supported the last one, the HB 3088. So there is feelings there. I think people do care about this issue, but it's maybe not the most pressing one on some people's minds.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to think that with the prevalence of OnlyFans in the last couple of years and other forms of sex work becoming, I don't know if democratized is maybe the best word to use, but becoming more socially acceptable in a lot of ways, that it would stand to reason that we could be working towards something along these lines. But I guess I'm just not convinced that we really see that happening right now. Uh,
No,
yeah, weigh
with
in.
legislation protecting the LGBTQ community, the only real arguments that are proposed are bigot, icky arguments by shitheels, or religious arguments by people with 3,000-year-old morality. With this sex work, and I mean that with the greatest love, 3,000-year-old morality. with the sex work issue, look at us three. You know, the more we research into this, the cloudier it gets.
Sure.
And what you have here are these initiatives that would change the way we treat an industry's way of doing business that has been in place for, a very, 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 very long time. And I think there are legitimate concerns of people being victimized, being trafficked, that doesn't prey upon prudishness. Because the prudishness argument doesn't hold any water for me. Go fuck yourself, you know. But I'm worried about people being, kidnapped or sold by parents. I think that's a legitimate humanist claim. And much like I'm not an economist, so I can't really say what's the best regulatory scheme. I'm not a law enforcement expert. I'm not. There's a regimen here. There's a regime of law enforcement, of protections, a legal scheme that could work most effectively. And I think there's a balancing act that we would need to strike. There's a balance that needs to be struck between, where are the rights going to? The right of the individual to exercise their bodily autonomy. Do we want to have these things happen openly in the public square, with the full knowledge that that could result in nastiness behind the scenes? Or do we want to keep it behind the scenes entirely where the nastiness is already taking place? I really don't know. I'm very suspicious that legalization or decriminalization, as I've seen it, is really going to completely eliminate the abuses in the system. And I want to know what's most effective, because maybe there's a certain amount of ugliness that's going to exist.
And well, I definitely empathize with that. And I think, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, we want the same things, that human trafficking is bad. I can say that objectively. Human trafficking is bad, and the decriminalization or legalization of sex work should necessarily include protections to make sure that sex trafficking isn't happening. We don't want that either.
Yeah.
Just because we want the right to freely be able to practice sex work does not mean that I want impunity for people who might be trafficking humans. That's obviously horrible. But I think there's so much fear of any of that happening that we aren't doing anything. And when we're looking at the stats right now from the Oregon Human Rights Commission released a report that was kind of the impetus for this ballot measure to be pushed through, that was suggesting how little of arrests that are made with regard to the selling of sex actually and it had anything to do with human trafficking, and that the majority was criminalizing the sellers or the people who helped the sellers, which granted could be anyone from a pimp who is maybe not treating people correctly to a friend who is helping out in the house with them.
Right.
So I think while I agree that there are definitely concerns and that this might not reduce human trafficking, right now we're not really helping human trafficking. We are just criminalizing perfectly innocent.
I agree.
We're going to keep diving into maybe what the best solution is or what to do about it. But I guess what I'm curious about, Arden, I kind of heard you weigh in on this, but ultimately, does this current moment feel sustainable? The model that we have now, regardless of what we're headed to or what that should look like, is it at all conscionable to keep doing what we're doing, or is it better to deal with the issues that we know rather than taking on something that could have a lot of unintended consequences and making massive change here?
Is the devil the devil you know versus the devil you don't?
Sure.
I think it's worth a try. You said, is it sustainable? And the answer is, sexism and racism has been sustainable for 10,000 years. So this way we're doing things is definitely sustainable. We can keep on doing it and pointing the blame at service providers if we want to. But I do think that I'm a little bit of a um, harsh person when it comes to crime. Now, I understand, and I did my research, that a lot of the people that are in the procuring business are themselves the victims of abuse
Sure.
and other ugliness that humanity inflicts upon themselves. I actually know someone whose um, son's father was a pimp, and his father was a pimp, and his grandfather was a pimp. And my friend was concerned that her son was going to maybe not be a pimp, but at the very least be engaged in exploiting people, whatever that might
Sure.
mean. Right. And so tried to break the cycle. And I'm concerned about that um, a lot because it's like, where do you grab the, what thread do you pull? Our society is functions, it's sustainable in some form, but it's also very broken.
Hmm.
And I do think that, so when I say I'm a little bit harsh, I really want to see those who inflict those abuses, right? Not the friend who's helping manage sex workers or a cooperative of sex
Mm-hmm.
workers who are just trying to, they watch each other's backs and they pay for marketing costs. But the ugly ones, the boyfriends or whoever, who are saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful. It would be just wonderful if you'd come to me," because that's my research shows. A lot of times it starts with a dishonest person who tries to lure girls. They talked about an example of a guy walks up to a group of girls and said, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And the girl who looks down to her shoes, and I'm using girls for an example because that was the example that was in the podcast that I listened to, that's the one he goes for. Preys upon our vulnerability. We all have it, but those people are poisonous serpents amongst society, and they themselves have been poisoned by something, right? And my natural animal instinct is throw the fucking book at those pieces of shit. On the other hand, I recognize that no one exists in a vacuum, and there's a cause to that person's behavior as well. So I'd rather see the worst actors attacked, you know. And while there's discussion, what I did watch some research, and Arden and I had a conversation about this. We actually talked about this before a couple months ago, I think, about legalization versus decriminalization. But in Amsterdam, the government, the Netherlands, looked back and saw that the brothels in Amsterdam were run entirely or majority by organized crime, and that there were examples of people being trafficked from around the world, vulnerable populations being pulled into sex work. And because the police weren't looking at them, they were able to behave with impunity right out in the open. And they would pretend to be bodyguards, but in fact, they were prisoners, or prison guards in some respects. I don't know if that's true, but what I can say is that you can set up standards for behavior. And you can say if a person, although you might be able to um, operate a brothel, there are certain standards that you have to meet, and maybe focus the spotlight on the procurers, on the managers, on those people, and maybe leave the workers alone. Now, I don't know what you do about co-ops. No idea. I actually don't have any idea on what the answer is. And I think you were saying, Christy, we have a nation of 50 states and a couple territories. Let's see. Let's let
solve some of that
yeah.
data problem by
Yeah.
actually experimenting and seeing what fits. I definitely appreciate that idea. And I guess I want to just highlight and give y'all both a chance to respond to what I'm maybe noticing as the distinction between y'all's two perspectives, which is that on the one hand, you have basically almost every, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but nearly all sex workers' rights groups favoring decriminalization because it will, in most situations or very likely, benefit current sex workers to be operating under that model. But what I maybe hear from you, Johnny, is that the concern is not necessarily just about current sex workers, but the folks that might find themselves in that situation or put into that position if we were to change some of the regulations around all of this. Is
Yeah,
that maybe a fair way of framing some of the space between y'all here?
maybe. Um, it's up to Arden, but I know that there's a racial component and a class component here that the advocates for decriminalization seem to not address as directly as I'd like to see.
Sure.
And it's if you are one of the people that was speaking, and we were sharing videos earlier today, was saying there was a criticism of this person. I wish I had the person's name. Maybe Arden has it. It's like it was an advocate, a public speaker going on tours, and someone had accused her of not being representative of the average sex worker.
Mm.
And she did a little soft shoe side dance and said, well, what is the average sex worker? I mean, it's people middle class, and it's this and it's that. And all I can think of is 13-year-old girls and boys in Thailand. That's what I think of, because she's not speaking for them. In my eyes, she's not. She's speaking for people like her. Is she speaking for people in economically disadvantaged areas, perhaps African American or Latino, in big cities who are walking the streets, and are maybe have heavy drug problems? Or are they talking about the, all due respect, Alice Littles of the world, people who are pulling in $1 million working at the Bunny Ranch?
Hmm.
Good for her, right?
Yeah,
I'm worried
I think
about
philosophically we're all on board with that idea
yeah,
existing, but it's protecting the other folks. But
yeah,
Arden, why don't you weigh in here before we jump on the phones?
Yeah, I'm antsy. Let me just be like a person to say that like this is overwhelmingly a race issue, right? The
yeah,
Mm,
Oregon Human Rights Report that was the incentive for this bill, the ballot proposition rather, uh, showed that when it came to people who were arrested for selling sex, African Americans
yeah,
were 8 times more
yeah,
likely to be arrested than white people, right? If you think that's crazy, wait till you hear the next number of people who were arrested for helping selling sex, Black people were 17 times more likely to be arrested. So this is overwhelmingly a racial issue. I think there were also some stats that I don't have them off the top of my head because I'm still, I just barely read this report today and it's still a little fresh in my mind, but I
mhm,
believe that one of the biggest demographics who actually gets trafficked were migrants. So
yeah,
yeah, like
absolutely.
yeah,
beyond the shadow of a doubt, this is definitely a highly racialized issue. People who get into sex work, we always talk about it's a low barrier to entry, and high pay. They're going to be people who are from marginalized groups and from lower class,
Sure.
like economically.
mhm,
That's what's going to pull you out of poverty a lot of the time. But unfortunately, the fact that it's criminalized is what keeps a lot of people stuck in that industry. And there are fears, and I think that have been demonstrated with issues with like the Nordic model, for example, with like legalization, where there kind of becomes a two-tier system, where there are people who often the more affluent sex workers who happen to be more white, they get their licenses, they get their ability to do sex work legally, but then the poor marginalized people who are the most oppressed by law enforcement and society for being sex workers don't have as easy of an avenue to get into the legal sex work and are therefore still in the same exact spot that they are with the current system. So definitely this is a racial issue, but
mhm.
from what I've read, it seems to be that decriminalization would be the most effective at addressing that I've heard of so far. It's not to say that
Yeah.
there wouldn't be a more effective method proposed, but it seems to me that legalization has some issues with aiding with the racial component, whereas decriminalization is specifically tailored to address the issues of
Works well in
how,
that aspect. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
before we go to calls, can I ask one question, Christy,
Sure.
or we can go call? There's decriminalization, and then there's total decriminalization. there's a
Sure. Yeah.
difference,
Is there room
right?
for a blended model here? And I think
Yeah.
that's probably going to be at least somewhat inevitable. And we'll
Mhm.
talk through some of those particulars. I guess the last seed I want to plant here is just to acknowledge that everything we're talking about when we're considering the fears around sex trafficking and of minorities being trafficked into and out of countries other than their nation of origin, that our numbers are almost garbage. I don't want to dismiss all of the data that has been collected. I do want to say that it is incredibly difficult to get any sense of how useful any of that information is. So we don't honestly know in a compelling way whether that is a high prevalence issue or a reasonably low prevalence issue. Clearly, we would all agree that on a planet with 7.5 billion people, one person being trafficked into sexual slavery is an abomination. But how common is this? That's a meaningful question that we haven't really answered.